looking at this in the flesh, this is like the difference between buying a Rolex and moaning that it doesn't cost the same as a Swatch watch. This is craftsmanship. Hi there everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Jennifer Kirk, welcoming you up here to the loft on Weir Yard. But today we're going to be moving over to one of my other layouts, Untitled. The reason for this? Well, Heljan have very kindly sent over one of their new Baldwin 242 tank locomotives in OO9. This is Lynn, the locomotive that was built to complete the quartet of the core locomotive fleet of the Linton and Barnstable. They've already done the Manning-Wardle trio, so this was the next logical step for them. It's finally come through and I'm really excited to be able to take a look at one of these. So a big thank you to Heljan for sending one over for review. But without further ado, let's take a close look at today's model. In today's review, we're going to be looking at the all-new 242 Baldwin from Heljan that has been released in a number of different liveries. And this is a locomotive that, whilst it was a fairly standard export model from the Baldwin Locomotive Company, it's one that was unique to the Linton and Barnstable Railway, and of their starting fleet of 4 locomotives when the line opened, the other 3 were all Manning-Wardles. Now, Manning-Wardle were approached for actually building a 4th locomotive to run the line, but they were swamped with orders and couldn't deliver it within the time frame needed. So the management turned to the Baldwin Locomotive Works in the US, and they put together as a kit of parts one of these 242 locomotives that was shipped over and then assembled at the Linton and Barnstable Railway's own works in time for the opening of the line. Now, we've already reviewed on the channel the Manning-Wardle that Heljan produced, and this model, actually, I was very impressed with it. It's got a lot of adhesive weight, and whilst it doesn't go around particularly tight curves, it has to be said that the originals didn't either. The Linton and Barnstable Railway, whilst narrow gauge, was very much built and laid out to the same sort of standards that we would expect on a standard gauge railway, and that meant gentle curves, light gradients, and a really well engineered route. Now, I've been more than impressed with these, and in fact I built a whole narrow gauge layout off the back of reviewing these locomotives, and I've been really pleased with it. And actually, even though they've gained a reputation for needing quite gentle curves, the reality of that in OO9 is that you can still fit a continuous run layout in a relatively small space and still run these perfectly reliably. And that's what I did with Untitled, which is essentially a continuous running OO9 layout in less than 3 foot square. I think it's safe to say that once Heljan brought out the Manning-Wardle, it was only a matter of time before they turned their sights to the other locomotive from the Linton and Barnstable Railway stable. And I'd like to thank Heljan for sending over this particular example for review today. Catalogue number 9981, this represents Baldwin 242 Lynn in the Linton and Barnstable Railway dark green, which is pre-1906. So this appears to be the original livery. Heljan have also produced it in the slightly later Linton and Barnstable Railway livery, the very early southern plain olive green, and then the final southern olive green with that very familiar E number on the side, and that was the guise in which the locomotive ran until finally it was scrapped. Just like the Manning-Wardle, there is a replica that has been built of this 242 Baldwin as well, so it is possible to see just how the real locomotive would have looked. The box has a thin card slipcase, and actually quite surprised it's got a plastic acetate window on there. Some of the previous Heljan models have just dispensed with that and actually made more use of the fact that the model itself is already coming in this plastic outer. I'm just going to tip that out there, and we do get some instructions here, which also shows in colour the other liveries that are available from Heljan of this model. The other livery that I missed out is this Works Black livery, which actually would be pretty useful for some of the other locomotives that the Baldwin Locomotive Company made to this fairly standard export design. So in terms of usability for modelers around the globe, this one could well be the sleeper hit. We also get a little bit of information about how to DCC fit this, and I'm going to be taking a look at that a little bit later on towards the end of this video. We also get a brief history of the locomotive, and it's something that's always nice to see in all of these releases, that we get something about the history of the locomotive that we've bought. Inside the inner blister case, it's actually really well packaged. So we've got an outer, and then we have to kind of fold down all of this and just pop that open, lift the locomotive out. I'm just going to show you as well, we've got in the extra detail pack just a pair of cow catchers, which, similar to what we got with the Manning Wardle you see on the front there, essentially you can replace the couplings, which are the standard Pico style, with these cow catchers. For example, if you've got the locomotive at the front of a train and you just want to dispense with that front coupling. With the locomotive out of the packaging, it's actually very obvious to see that there is a lot of fine detail on this model. In terms of livery, this is possibly one of the more basic liveries that Heljan have released of this model, and I think that a lot of people would probably be swayed towards that Southern Monsal green. But actually, this model, suitable for the pre-grouping period, I think really shows off the locomotive's American roots even better. It also shows up a lot of the detail too. So I can see on the top there, there's a lot of extra rivet detail and separately applied pieces, including those brass straps across the top of the boiler that held the tanks together on the original prototype. The locomotive itself sports 3 domes. Only the centre one has safety valves on it, but it's also got these 2 either side, which kind of gave this a very, very distinctive appearance. The cab too, fully enclosed, and I'm sure that this would have been a popular locomotive amongst the working crews, because it would have given an awful lot of protection from the elements. Although in the summer, in the sunshine, it might also be said that it could probably be quite warm. Although these side windows on the prototype would slide open, they don't do that on the model, but these very, very extensive windows in the cab do give a great view of the inside of that cab with all of that backhead detail in place. And actually, even though it's fully enclosed, it doesn't obstruct your view of any of that lovely detail that is inside there. If you wish to add a crew, I think though that it's going to need a little bit of careful dismantling, because the cab roof itself it does appear to be integral to the moulding, so it may well be that you have to take the body off to get in there to do that. The coal moulding on the back is in this absolutely full condition. There's no real room to add too much in the way of crushed up real coal over the top. And as far as I can see, that doesn't actually come out. But in terms of mouldings go, actually that's not too bad, and I think most people would be more than happy to leave that be. And those bars on the backs of the windows, it's actually a bit difficult to tell whether they are part of the glazing assembly or whether they are separately fitted, but certainly they do look really, really good. And you can also see on this close-up that really, really fine gold lining that is really crisply applied. But looking on the back there, it does look like the radius in the corners has been missed out, and I'm not sure whether that's a feature of the original locomotive. But certainly that does look a little bit odd on close-up, but I can only assume that Heljan have faithfully reproduced this from photographs of the original locomotive. The cab roof is a really vibrant red oxide, which does make this locomotive stick out. The detail on it is really nice and crisp. There's a lot of separate riveting, and that roof hatch is modelled in the fully shut position, and it isn't a posable piece. When we look to the Manning Wardle, on that model, 3 of the 4 roof hatches were modelled in the permanently open position, with the 4th one in the shut, which I thought was actually a really nice touch. On this model, we just get the one closed. In some respects, it's a little bit of a shame. It might have been nice to be able to see some of that exquisite backhead detail in there, but I can't help but be left thinking that I'm possibly in the minority on that, and people would have just complained if it had been modelled in the open position. Looking to the front of the locomotive, we've got a very distinctive, widening, almost slightly triangular shape to the front of the running plate. And this has led to, in a number of photographs, the model looking slightly bent. Well, I can verify that the model is not bent in any way, and it's just an optical illusion in some of those photographs, born out of the fact that this model accurately captures that almost strange looking front of this locomotive. In the flesh, it doesn't actually look too bad. I had been a bit worried from the photographs that it was going to look really odd, but I can assure you it actually does look good in person. The front face of this locomotive has that characteristic American look of this Baldwin Locomotive Company's product, with that smokebox door that has an awful lot of raised detail on it. The brake pipes come ready fitted, and there's also separately applied pipework there across the front of the running plate of those pipes going back. I also really like these here, these pipes from the top of the cylinders that go up, and it just oozes quality. Now, the price tag might put some people off, be it that I've found this for just a shade over the £200 mark in a number of different shops that I've looked at. But it has to be said that looking at this in the flesh, this is like the difference between buying a Rolex and moaning that it doesn't cost the same as a Swatch watch. This is craftsmanship, and the level of detail really does go a long way to justify that price tag. This is a model where no compromise has been made. Looking to the underside, we've got those outside frames there and some really exquisite detail, both on the springs, but also all of those connecting rods and the piston detail. The more I look at this, the more there is to see that I really do like. Just looking down inside there, there's a couple of strange marks where it looks like the black paint has been flaked off. But actually, even though that is a little bit obvious with the model upside down like this, I don't think it's a problem because you're never going to see that. I do love as well, the more I look, there's more separately applied detail. This pipework in this kind of coppery brass really is nice, and all of these pipes down the side are separately applied. This really is an exquisite model. I also really like these front and rear pony trucks. Those wheels really do capture that spoked look of the originals so well, and they've got that kind of spindly, prototypically accurate look, which really does look nice. We've got pickups from them as well, so the electrical pickup on this model is actually pretty reasonable. Now, I've had an initial run of it on the DCC Concepts Rolling Road, and it ran really quite well straight out of the box. The model features a coreless motor, and actually, from out of the box, it was a reasonably smooth runner on that rolling road. There was just a slight squeak that I could perceive, but the more I ran it, it very quickly disappeared, and the model settled down to be a pretty smooth and faultless performer on DC. When it comes to the rest of the printing, that Lin on the side, the locomotive's name, is really sharply done. I also really like the builder's plate just up here at the front, and I'm sure on the close-ups we're going to be able to read that. That does look really sharp. Heljan have also tooled up for some of the detail differences that this locomotive sported throughout its lifespan, as odd parts were changed. One of the things that was noticeable on these is that the funnel did change through the locomotive's life, and Heljan do appear from the enclosed datasheet to have tooled up accordingly to represent these changes. For the DCC fitting, I'm going to break with tradition. Now, I think pretty much everybody does know that I work for DCC Concepts, and that means I normally try and fit in one of the DCC Concepts decoders. But unfortunately, they're just slightly too big to fit in this model, and I'll give a word of warning here. You do need a really small 6-pin decoder, and I've tried a number of different brands, and what I can say is that the Zen Blue Plus decoders won't fit. The Trainomatic decoders won't fit. I've also tried Bachmann, Hornby, Rails Connect and Hatton's, and none of those I can get to fit into this locomotive. It's a really, really tight fit. I've even tried the decoder that was in this, and that actually turned out to be a Trainomatic decoder from when I did the review on this model. So what I actually have chosen, after going through a huge number of different locomotives, just looking to see what they actually had in them from when I DCC fitted them, and I believe that this is a lens decoder, and it's certainly a lot smaller than any of the other decoders, and I've matched it up with the blanking plug from this, and this will fit into the slot. Now, you don't get a lot of wiggle room in this locomotive, so you really need a decoder which is really, really tiny. And I'm going to just get my ruler here, and I'm just going to put it down here next to this decoder so you can see that this is pretty much on the limit of the size that you need. So this decoder is 11 millimeters long, and let's just see there now. We've got pretty much, I say that's either 8 or let's say 9 millimeters wide. And what I found actually is that most decoders, width-wise, as in the width of the pins, they're all pretty much the same. But length-wise, there does seem to be some variety. So be warned, if you buy one of these, you need to make sure that the decoder that you buy to go with it is as small as you can get it. But now we've got that out of the way, let's crack on and let's get inside this locomotive and get it DCC fitted. Now, the tools I'm going to need for this, we've got the trusty small-sized Phillips screwdriver, and you're also going to need a pair of tweezers. Now, trust me on this, this is quite a lot more involved than the Manning Wardle was, where you just took 2 screws off and the whole body lifted up, and there's a lot of space inside that one. This is a little bit more complicated, so we're going to go through now the steps that you need to do. First up, we're going to need to remove this little bit of detail from the front. These just flick out, and in all honesty, just to stop them from getting lost, I'm actually going to take them out completely, and this is just so that whilst you're doing something else in the model, they don't go walkabout, and it's very easy to happen, in all honesty with you. Underneath the model, what we now need to do next is we're going to take the front bogie off. This is fairly straightforward. Just put that screw there, and that just lifts off. We're grand with that, not a problem. And that exposes we've got a screw here. And I'm going to undo that. And just so that you remember, that's a slightly longer screw, just so you don't get it mixed up later on. That loosens up this whole front smoke box piece, and you can see now why we had to take those stays off. And what you may also have to do is just tease out some of these extra pipes, just to make sure that they don't catch on anything. And then that whole front smoke box, just put that over there nice and safe. The next thing, we turn the model round, and this is where you start to have to be a little bit more careful. I'm going to undo the screw for the rear pony truck. Now with this is where the careful warning comes in. I'm just going to fold that back there because that's actually connected by 2 wires. That's part of the pickups. And underneath you'll see the reason that we've had to take that off. We've got a screw there and a screw there. That one's quite an easy one to miss once you've delved into this and you end up wondering why the top won't come off. So I'm going to take this one off first, which just secures the back of the cab. And you can see that that's a smaller screw. And then this screw here, and this one, just get in there. That's the same size as the one that we took out at the front. So we've got 2 long, 1 small. Now be careful what you grab hold of. The entire body just now lifts off. I'm going to put that over there, and this is an ideal opportunity if you want to fit a crew into this locomotive. You should be looking to do that at the same time. Now inside the locomotive, what we've got is at the front we've got this circuit board that just slides up and out. Now don't put any pressure on these wires because they are quite fine where they're soldered to this board. And then we've got the blanking plate here at a 90-degree angle. And this is where the issue with the decoders comes in. Because what we actually have here, we have a slot in the chassis, but it's actually quite short. And it does really restrict the type of decoder you can put in there. And as you can see, there's no real other space around it to be able to run wires. So we can't easily just have a wired 6-pin and hide that in the cab. Now you could hardwire it, but what you would have to make sure that you did was to make sure that these wires don't get chewed. You're going to have to cut a groove in the back head of the cab if you go down that route. But that would be an option that would allow you to, say, fit a sound installation so you could get the wires through to get a speaker in the cab, or if you wanted to stay alive as well, that would be another way of doing that. But what we're actually going to do is just do a plain DCC install with this lens decoder. So very, very carefully rip and wiggle, and just pay attention to the orientation on this. So I'm going to hold the board up so you can see there the top is number 1 and the bottom is number 6. If you get this decoder the wrong way around, all that will happen is that basically nothing will happen. It won't damage your decoder, but your locomotive won't work. Now, a little tip here for you is when I did the test fit, I actually bent this socket just down a little bit, and the reason for that was because that the lens decoder, when fitted in, would otherwise be pushed hard against the inside of there, and we don't want that because it was causing a short. And this is where it's vital that you're very, very careful with the install on this. Now, I would have said put a little bit of electrical tape down there, but the decoder is actually quite tight in there and it's going to introduce other problems. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to line this up, and I can feel that because I've bent that down ever so slightly, this isn't now tight in the slot. I'm just going to push it down to there. It does rub a little bit, and that's as down as far as it'll go. And what I'm going to do now, and this is something I would highly recommend with this model because it's quite fiddly to get the top off, is this goes on the test track now, on your programming track, and just get your programming track to read the decoder ID. If it comes up, and if that's a new decoder, it will be set to a default of 3. It needs to read that as 3, and you'll hear the locomotive motor sort of twitching with the pulses, and that'll tell you that that install is fine. Do not put it on your layout at this point. We just need to make sure that there's no weird shorts or anything before we start to reassemble this locomotive. So I'm going to quickly test that now, and then we'll come back and finish the decoder install. Okay, I've come back from that. I've put it on the programming track and it's read that decoder just fine. So I'm going to take it from that we are okay to continue with reassembling the model. Essentially at this point, it's just a reverse of what we did before. So let's just make sure that these wires are not going to get caught on anything. Let's just separate them. There is a piece of metal in there which does seem to be potentially a bit at risk of squashing stuff. So let's just move that down. Now, as you've probably noticed, this is a very involved DCC fit. Now, this detail on the back of the cab, just need to make sure that that's not jamming. Let's push that in. And then let's just carefully move that back. First one in. Small one at the back. Let's not forget that. Don't over torque them. You don't want to strip any threads. And then let's just make sure that that coupling isn't getting jammed. Line that up. Let's just get that rear bogie in place. Okay, that's in place. So the back of this is all done. Now, that does look like it's ridden up a little bit, so let's just test fit the smoke box in there. Okay, that's in. And then I'm just going to put the front bogie into place. And before I just finish off again, I want to return this to the programming track to make sure that all is well, and then I will finish with those two bits of detail that's there. Okay, everything's tested fine, so let's just get the last of these two, and they are handed, so you need to make sure you put them the correct way round. Just going to put that in there. Just tuck that into place. You just feel it slot in. And the second one, they're not too difficult, but you do need a pair of tweezers really for this. Slot it in at the bottom, and just maneuver the top. You'll feel it just sort of slot into place. And there we have it. Just double check all the other pipe fittings. Should just replace themselves into those holes. So a lot of little bits of detail. And there you have it, fully DCC fitted. So let's take this off now to Untitled, my OO9 layout, and let's see how well it runs. The running qualities of this locomotive are stretched to the limit really on Untitled. It does a full circuit here in less than 3 feet square, and it's right on the limit of what these locomotives are comfortable with. I actually had to remove the rear coupling on Lynn, but I don't hold that against the locomotive. We're probably underneath the recommended minimum curvature. The Manning Wardle I did find ran a little bit better, and when you compare the two of them, the Manning Wardle is a lot heavier. And I'm starting to understand why the chassis block on Lynn takes up as much space as it could. Really, it just needs everything it can for that extra traction. There were instances where I found that the locomotive ended up balanced on the front and rear pony trucks with the wheels spinning, so I had to adjust the springs underneath, and that did help a lot. But actually removing the rear coupling was probably the biggest aid to traction, and it's something that I guess a lot of people may find if you've got very tight corners, that it's best to remove that rear coupling and have Lynn just run backwards and use that coupling on the front, which didn't seem to affect the locomotive in the same way. Overall, I'm actually quite pleased with it. Now that I've got that DCC fitting out of the way, it really is a pleasing locomotive and really does provide a really fine partner for those Manning Wardles already in the Heljan stable. DCC fitting of Lynn, though, was a challenge compared to the really easy way that the Manning Wardle just accepts a 6-pin decoder. There also isn't really any easy room for a stay alive, and I did feel when running Lynn that even a small stay alive would have helped it on some of the track on Mynydde Tatus. In some respects, those really tight pico curves that we've got, and also the pico points, did prove a little bit of a challenge, with Lynn prone to stalling at very low speed. But actually that's not much different from what I found with the Manning Wardle as well. Those pico turnouts are actually quite a challenge for any locomotive, and it must be remembered that the Linton and Barnstable Railway was laid out very much more like the mainline railways rather than something that was indeed narrow gauge. One of the other points as well, which isn't apparent from this locomotive, the later Southern Railway liveried versions of Lynn come with a lamp on the front, similar to what you see on the Manning Wardle. However, unlike the Manning Wardle, the lamp does actually work on that version of the Baldwin, and that is a nice touch, making use of the extra function on the 6-pin decoder. And I'm sure that it's something that is more and more welcomed by modelers in OO9, that they're actually getting some of the extra functionality that DCC can provide. Overall, I'm quite pleased with this locomotive. It really does look the part. It is a Swiss watch in terms of its construction, and it is light years away from some of the poor mechanisms that we've seen in the dim and distant past for OO9 that made it feel like a very poor cousin to the larger OO models. Lynn really does firmly cement the Heljan tanks on the lawn of this scale, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what else comes through from Heljan in this scale. What it's actually going to show is that there is a good, healthy market for models in this gauge, and I, for one, really look forward to what else Heljan might have cooking up in the background waiting for release. So we come now to the scores, and first up is build quality, and actually this locomotive has stood up remarkably well to some quite rough handling. I had to dismantle it, obviously, to do that DCC fitting, and it actually hasn't suffered for that at all, and all of those detail parts have gone back in without breaking, snapping, or otherwise being compromised. There's nothing that's fallen off and been lost, and that's something which I've seen afflict other locomotives, where a little bit of handling leaves a small pile of detailing in the bottom of the box or on your desk. There's no such problem with this locomotive at all. It can be a little bit fiddly in places, but I'm actually quite pleased how these stays at the front of the smoke box have actually stood up to being taken on and off, and they do seem to stay put quite well. Overall, I'm really pleased, so I'm quite happy to give this a 9.6. Next up is running quality. This is an area that the locomotive did struggle a little bit on the really tight curves of Mynydde Tatus, but actually they really are at the extreme, and the locomotive did manage to get round and traverse those really quite tight pico Y points and first radius left-hand points. So actually, all in all, it's done pretty well, considering most OO9 layouts wouldn't really get quite that severe. I had it running for quite some time, and the only modification I really had to do to get it to do that was to remove the rear coupling. Partly this was because otherwise it limited the travel of that rear pony truck, and that in turn meant that it tended to lift the driving wheels off the track, and they would spin up and not give any traction to the model. But without that coupling in play, it really did fix that problem, and I had no issues with derailments. I didn't test the locomotive with any great load, but it did seem to have plenty of reserve once it was running properly on the track. I could even turn it down somewhat so that it wasn't quite so fast, but I did find that some kind of stay alive might be of benefit for this locomotive, and the cab does provide ample room, but you're going to have to do a little bit of modification to be able to wire that through to the decoder. So I'm going to give this a 7.8. Next up is the DCC fitting and innovation, and this was an area where I could certainly see there being some degree of frustration with modelers as they try and find a decoder to fit. That's one of the reasons that I've done the DCC fitting guide, and I've used that really small lens decoder. As long as your decoder is about the same size as that, which was around 11 millimeters long from plug to far end, then it will just fit in the slot inside the chassis. I understand from the running quality that really this locomotive needs every bit of extra weight that it can, and that's probably one of the reasons that they've been quite stingy with the space for a decoder, because they didn't really want to mill out anything further from that chassis. There are decoders on the market that do fit locomotives that are this tight on space, but you just need to make sure that that's what you buy for this when you do, because if you buy some of the more regular brands, you're going to be disappointed that they don't fit. I also found that I had to bend the socket somewhat because the lens decoder didn't quite line up with the socket and was at risk of shorting if I didn't do that. However, with that quite easy modification, everything worked pretty well, and as long as you're methodical in the dismantling and the reassembly, it actually wasn't too difficult to get this locomotive apart to get access to the decoder, as long as you followed those simple steps. It's certainly not the easiest of DCC fits that I've ever done, but again, it's probably not the most difficult either, and it does pay dividends to do a trial run. Make sure that you put this locomotive on the programming track and check it at various stages of the reassembly just to make sure, because otherwise you're going to have to assemble and dismantle the locomotive several times if you get unlucky. So I'm going to give this an 8.0. When it comes to accuracy and quality of finish, this is an area where Heljan have done really, really well. They've modelled the locomotive very, very accurately, and it does feel that what we've got here is a Rolex rather than a Swatch. The detail on that underframe and the chassis detail, and also these pony trucks, really is second to none. I also really like the cab with those big windows that give you a lot of detail on the inside. This locomotive would probably benefit from a crew, and in all honesty, if I was going to town on this, I would probably make sure that I got some kind of a stay alive in there as well. I think it would probably fit quite nicely and unobtrusively down at the bottom of the cab, and indeed it may be worth investigating whether you can add a little bit of extra weight in there as well, just to improve the running quality. The finish on the livery really is nice, and we've got some great detail in terms of the lining, which is straight and true, and those works plates at the front are really, really nice. This livery is probably one of the more austere if we discount the works black livery, but certainly it has quite a nice charm to it. And for those modelers that want to model the pre-grouping period in narrow gauge, this really is an ideal opportunity. But Heljan haven't forgotten the other periods that this locomotive ran in, and I particularly like that southern Monsal green with the working headlamp on the front. If I had to pick from all of the liveries that Heljan have done, I think that would probably be my personal choice. And if that's the one that you want, I would recommend getting in there quickly because they will not hang around. So I'm going to give this model a 9.2. On value for money, you do get a piece of craftsmanship for what you pay. But the price on this locomotive, which you can see there compared to my hand, is quite diminutive, is quite a lot. I've seen them out there discounted down to just a shade over £200. And that, it must be added, is just DCC ready. If you want to make it DCC enabled, you've also got the cost of that decoder too. But you do get a really nice piece of workmanship for that money. And all things considered, small doesn't necessarily mean cheaper. In many ways, miniaturization costs a lot of money. And for a locomotive that runs and looks this good, then really, I think you're getting a good bargain. And let's not quibble about price. When you look to the underside, we've got pickups off all 4 main driving wheels, plus that rear bogie. So actually, it does run reasonably well. And if you've got less challenging track, unlike I've got on Mineth Tatis, this is going to be a faultless performer. So I'm going to give this a 7.9. And that gives us an overall score of a very credible 42.5. Don't forget that we've got a link in the description box down below that takes you to Rails of Sheffield to pick up any of the liveries that are available, so don't delay today because these are sure to sell out quickly. We don't have a link to the Dcc Decoder for this locomotive, but what I can say to you is you need to pay very close attention to that size footprint, otherwise you will be disappointed on the fitting. There's no real wiggle room on this, so you need to get it right first time. Well, I hope you really enjoyed that review and found it really informative. If you did, don't forget to tickle the like button and also share it too to let others know about a great video when they see one. And also, I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below, where you can let me know your thoughts on this model from Heljan, and I do read every single comment. I'd love to hear from you if you've got one of these models or if you're considering buying one. And to be honest, I'd love to hear from you anyway if you want to suggest a topic for a future video. But until next time, this is me, Jenny Kirk, saying you take great care of yourself. Happy modelling. I'd like to send out a huge thanks to everybody who supports me on Patreon. And an extra special huge thanks goes out to Anthony Kidson, Offshore Allen, oorail.co.uk, Michael Lockie, Helen Sink, Peter Bolton, Brian and Dorothy Mudd, Gary Lewis, David Quinn, Sparky107107, George Botterini, Chris Moss, Robert Steers, MD of San Juan Model Company and Grantline Products, Sam Yates, Dale Williams, John N. from NC, NYMRish, Jonathan Foster, Peter, Graham Foster, Clifford Ison, Larry W. Grant, NI Railways 4000 class, Ian Coulson, and Alan Dickerson. Thank you. Without you guys, I couldn't do this.